Hi, my name is Will, and today I wanted to talk a little bit about why is it that if AIs are taking over everything, if the CEO of NVIDIA is saying kids shouldn't learn to code, why is it that our software is so terrible right now? I use a lot of apps that are just awful. I use my banking apps, my insurance apps, my speaker equipment. The app that was put out recently broke everything for months. Even my car, I have to restart the infotainment system on every couple of weeks. That's what we're going to talk about today. Why is it that in a world of AI everywhere, we still have terrible software? There are 3 points that we're going to kind of hit on. One of them is the technical aspects. One of them is sort of the human and the systems aspects. And then the other one is what's next? How is this stuff going to evolve over time? So let's just start with the technical side. As I'm sure most of you know, when you're a software engineer and you sit down to go do your work, you open up a development environment or an integrated development environment or an IDE. And what the IDE is basically all the things that you need to do to get your job done, right? You can write your code, compile your code, debug your code, all that stuff in one place. It's kind of wild is for most developers today, what they're doing is basically just using these AIs as like chatbots. So just the same way that you might go to ChatGPT today and fire it up, that's the way a lot of software engineers start out working with these chatbots. Now, pretty quickly, you get tired cutting and pasting things back and forth. And so then you start looking for plugins that you can add to your IDE to make that whole process easier. Well, most of that stuff is still really, really early. They don't really solve a lot more of the problem than maybe just streamlining the copying and pasting of the code. For most folks, you can kind of get a sense of what would be like just same way you'd think about writing a letter to somebody if you were working with ChatGPT and then you had to keep cutting and copying, pasting stuff back and forth. It's pretty clunky. Now, there are tools that are just coming out right now that do a bit more than that, where they say, hey, we're going to actually feed a lot more of your code into a chatbot, and then we'll sort of streamline it under the covers. And I'm using stuff like that even for just writing stuff in Obsidian, which is the editor I use to write things. I now have a plugin where I can tell it to edit the document, and I can hit apply, and it will copy and paste the stuff over, which is cool, but also kind of not very groundbreaking. There are AI tools that are doing a bit more, but they're brand new. For example, there's all these tools like Bolt, V0, Cursor, Windsurf, and these tools are basically taking a standard development environment like VS Code, and then they create their own version of it where they've integrated in the AI stuff. So, for example, being able to type in something and say go, and it edits not just one file but several files. Or maybe it can actually run the software, like especially if it's a server. It launches the server and then it can monitor and look at the error messages as they're coming up. And that's starting to close that loop. So this stuff is brand new. There's a couple of packages, and one of them which is called Windsurf, which is the one that I've been playing with. And so it's doing some really interesting things, like it caches the queries that you're sending back and forth to improve the performance, and it understands more of the code. The thing that's really interesting to me about that is most of the IDEs already have this tooling built in that kind of gives a sense of all the code in the project, like sort of like getting a table of contents where everything is, and then being able to edit the table of contents. So for example, let's say that I use a development environment and I change the name of something. Well, most modern tools let you change that name everywhere all at once, kind of like a really super smart find and replace. So that's a refactoring system. Most of the AI tooling doesn't actually talk to the refactoring systems or the structural analysis stuff. So the IDEs are really at that early stage, and that's part of what's slowing everything down in terms of adoption of the tech. So it's just baseline. Tools aren't quite there yet. The next part of this, and this is kind of tools and kind of people, which is it's just moving so fast, no one can keep track of it. Here's a graphic. It's 120 mind-blowing AI tools. If you just spent an hour evaluating each one, you're talking about, weeks of work just to do an evaluation of these tools. And that's only an hour. So you're not necessarily going to get into the weeds and get to that feeling of competence like you really know it. In that environment, it's not surprising that a lot of folks aren't able to adopt things because maybe they haven't even heard of it. By way of example, Windsurf just came out a few weeks ago, maybe a month or two ago. So it's not surprising that a lot of software engineers haven't even had a chance to think about it yet. or how to tie it into their systems. The next piece that kind of slows things down is that a lot of this tooling by default, it's generating stuff that looks more like tutorial code or sample code and not full production code, which makes sense because if you think about what these AIs and these LLMs are trained on, of course they're going to start, it's going to give you this really, really basic example of how to do that, but it won't do all the error handling necessarily, which doesn't mean that it won't generate that if you ask it. But that right out of the gate is this sort of level of nuance, right? Like you say, generate this code, but also make sure it's production quality. The other piece is that a lot of good modern practices in software engineering, like writing automated tests for your server functions, that kind of stuff, the tools won't do unless you ask it to. If you're technical, you might say, oh, well, I'm just going to look at the code it generates, but you might forget to say, oh, I actually want to capture all my requirements and write automated tests, which then means that you're going to generate potentially huge amounts of code with no tests and no automation, which is part of why a lot of this stuff will fall over if you get into larger apps, just like any enterprise app. That means that you have to remember to prompt it to say, hey, generate production ready code. You want to say, hey, go ahead and write tests for it. What you wind up doing is reviewing all the code that it's generating. So it's not autonomous. It's just you're kind of like the dev manager pulling stuff in. The next piece on that is that a lot of the code that's generated tends to work better with older technology. For example, I found that if I just ask it to write vanilla SQL or PL/SQL or JavaScript or TypeScript or Java or whatever, the longer that the framework or the tool's been around, the more test data that there is for the LLM to have been trained on, which means you get much better results. One of the frameworks that I'm really interested in is Svelte 5, which is this brand new framework. It's barely been launched. If I ask an AI or an LLM to generate stuff related to that, generally speaking, it's going to be terrible because at most it's working off of just maybe the documentation that I uploaded, and that's it. If you're a developer watching this video, is go download Windsurf and say, build a simple app. And it could be a to-do list app or any other small app that you've been kind of itching. Just tell it to go ahead and build it in JavaScript and TypeScript, then ask it to generate the tasks, ask it to generate a schema for the database, ask it to generate PL/SQL, post-REST, REST services, for example, and just see what it does. And you start to get a sense of where it works and where it doesn't and what the challenges are. You can see it's this work in progress. It's not done yet. If this is state-of-the-art tooling, that's part of why this stuff isn't just solving all of our coding problems yet. There's just not enough framework and tooling and integration stuff to make this stuff work at scale. It's more like engineers copying and pasting things, or maybe you have some tooling that's able to do it a little bit further. But that's about where the state-of-the-art is for this stuff right now, which doesn't mean it's not impressive. I've asked it to generate small apps for me, and it's basically generated the whole thing in one shot. But that's not the same thing as a large enterprise app. Which brings us to the other side, which is kind of a human factor side, which is how do you pull all this stuff in? At one end, you've got companies that are basically just banning the use of AI across the board because they don't know about the liability issues, and they maybe don't feel comfortable sending, snippets or sending their code base to get processed by some LLM in the cloud. The flip side, of course, is that you could run LLMs locally on your own hardware, but a lot of corporate entities, they don't hardly even have a video card on their machine, much less something good enough to run a good LLM. So you have this huge range, right? The only people that might be able to run a good LLM locally might be a 32 gig or 64 gig, Apple Silicon device. And that's not very common in a lot of enterprise environments when you're handed a Dell with a built-in video card. At the other end, we've seen a lot of reports in the news about people who are just rushing this AI LLM stuff into production really, really fast. Maybe they've said, hey, we're going to put a chatbot on the website, and that's their version of AI, and then something terrible happens, and then they're in the news for it. The other piece is from a sort of human psychology standpoint, especially when you consider how overwhelming it can be to try to keep track of all these tools and all these systems. A lot of people will say something like, well, I tried it out a year ago, and it was kind of mediocre, which makes sense. I mean, if you were copying and pasting things from ChatGPT 3.5 or 3.0, and then you say, oh, whatever, it was great. It's not surprising that folks might not walk away with a good impression or feel like it's something to spend a lot of time on. Another component is this sort of feeling that if you're spending time and investing in AI or LLMs, all you're really doing is just training your replacement. Everybody has been through these waves of, you go into work one day and they announce that they're going to offshore your job. There's this feeling that if I'm downloading an LLM and I start playing with it and training it, that what I'm really doing is training my own replacement. That kind of back of the neck sort of itchy feeling that you might get. That, I think, is a factor why a lot of folks just don't even want to mess with it. Another piece of this is that sort of same challenge that some developers have trying to switch to a pair programming model, where if you're used to just sort of building this mental model in your head of what your app and your code is doing, is it easier to kind of get out of that flow and work with someone else? And I feel like a lot of the AI tech starts to feel a little bit like that. Like I'm working with this other partner and they're writing code and I'm pulling it in. Well, do I trust it? Do I want to deal with the integration? It's sort of a weird parallel to somebody who does PR merges all day long, where they're bringing in code that other people wrote, clicking accept, or maybe doing reviews on it, but they're not writing code themselves. It feels different, which kind of segues into this sort of like really odd space that we're in with the culture right now, where like most people would say it's totally fine to use the Microsoft Word grammar checker or spell checker, right? That's fine. But where do you draw that line around using an AI to help you with stuff or to do the work? So then you have this sort of strange phenomenon where you've got people who say it's terrible and awful and all these issues with it. Then you also have people who are using it, but they're using it secretly. I think that that's part of why we see like big usage numbers for AI, but not necessarily as many people wanting to talk about it, because just like everything is political nowadays, if I'm sitting at lunch, do I mention that I'm working with AI when I know I'm going to hear somebody complaining about it? Like, probably not going to talk about it. And that becomes part of the social challenge around using the tools. There's that vibe of like, well, yeah, there's that guy, maybe he was into crypto and now the crypto guy is coming into work and talking about AI. It makes you kind of roll your eyes a little bit. So the next piece of this is kind of this weird feeling about the human becomes like a liability shield for what the AI is generating. But let's say that you're a developer and you're working with the AI and it's generating all the code. Your job is then to essentially review the code and make sure it's okay. And this is kind of this weird good thing and bad thing, because as long as the AIs and the LLMs aren't good enough to just generate the apps completely with no human oversight, well, then we'll still have jobs, right? Somebody's going to have to monitor what they're doing. It's like being the person who watches over a fleet of robots all day, right? The bad news is that a good job? Is that the same reason why people got into coding in the first place, is if they wanted the intellectual challenge, but instead you're just doing reviews of other code. People say, well, I got into it to write code. Now I became a dev manager and all I do is go to meetings and maybe do code reviews. Is that the career that you signed up for? That aspect, both the liability shield and the sort of, do you feel like you're getting the fun out of your work, becomes a big part in why people do or don't adopt this stuff. One other part of this is that now you run into this challenge about how do you change your process, right? Let's say that you have a existing process in place for, somebody writes code, maybe it gets checked in, there's a PR process where it gets reviewed. Is there a place where you formally introduce AI into that review process? Right now, what we do is we tell humans to use their development environments to write their code and then check it in. And so whether or not they're using AI or not, or how much, is kind of left to the individual. So there's not really like a structured way that we say all this stuff gets pulled together. The crazy number of tools that are coming out every day doesn't really help with that adoption, because it's almost like, well, why put in an AI or an LLM system today when there's probably going to be a much, much better one available in 6 weeks? Why should I invest in an IDE from one of these vendors that just popped up 6 weeks ago and say, well, now I'm going to tell my team to adopt those structurally? So it's this very, very complicated set of issues, especially in a corporate and enterprise environment. Anything that's larger scale than just like, a couple guys working on something. So the next piece, of course, is what does this mean looking forward? So here's the first part. This is the snippet that you should send to your boss, which is, in order to really explore AI and LLMs, what you really need is a top-of-the-line Apple Silicon device with at least 64 gig of RAM so you can run an LLM locally on your machine. So that way you don't have to worry about cloud issues, security issues, all that kind of stuff. Good luck with that. The next piece of what's next is, I do think that we're just going to see more and more of this sort of shift or redefinition of what being a coder or being a software engineer means. It's going to be less about writing code by hand and a lot more about integrating things. And honestly, I don't know how big of a change that is, because for years now, a lot of people, the running joke was, well, all I do is cut and paste things off Stack Overflow all day. So in an environment where you used to be copying and pasting, now you're switching to having the AI do it for you to help you sort of massage through that copy paste work that you were doing before. my hope is that going forward, what happens is that we use the AI and the LLM technology, and that the systems by default generate apps that adhere a lot more to some best practices, like writing automated tests. If we just start using these things to just generate huge volumes of code without any kind of good process around it, then yeah, things are going to get even worse, because you'll get demo quality code everywhere. Hopefully we can sort of learn how to pull all those pieces together into a way that'll actually let us build good apps faster, cheaper, more fun, because we're not having to get into the weeds as much. We still have room and space for the places where people want to dive into it. But a lot of this stuff, it is sort of ordinary vanilla work. It's just doing the hard work of building software. So in a lot of ways, anything that can make that easier is probably a good thing. All right. With all that in mind, thank you so much for watching the video, and talk to you soon. Take care.